Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm just going to be reviewing doing a bit of a wrap up of the books I've read this week. Please ignore the pile of books, just very well hidden there. Really excited to talk about these. It's been quite an interesting one with just a few books that I've just been very excited to read. So let's get started with those. First up, I read Dr No by Percival Everett. And so Percival Everett is the author who was shortlisted last year for the Booker. There's a lot of sunlight suddenly coming in. Where has the sun been all day? Where have you been? So Dr. No by Percival Everett. And he was shortlisted for the Booker last year for The Trees, a really wonderful book that dealt with some difficult issues, but also through the lens of humour and absurdism and so many other things. And in many ways, Dr. No does the same. It's largely concerned with the idea of nothingness. And I don't think I've ever seen a book or read a book in my life that has the word nothing or no one in it quite so many times. So there's a character at the heart of it, Wasakitu, whose name is sort of two different ways of saying nothing in different languages. And he's a mathematician or sort of, and his main area of focus is on the study of nothing and of nothingness. And the book is kind of peppered all the way through with all of these sorts of jokes around nothing, where, you know, someone will say like, oh, what do you care about? And he'll say, oh, nothing. And people are like, oh, well, you're not passionate about a single thing? And he's like, no, I'm passionate about nothing. There's a lot of that. And maybe by the end of the book, I'm a bit like, but, you know, there are some fun moments. There's also a talking dog at one point, because that's a thing. So he has this dog called Trigo, which I think is meant to be a nod to like trigonometry and various other things. And just this, he basically goes through these kind of slightly wild romp adventures through the book. Bill Clinton is there at one point, or at least a character called him, and just so many other really random, absurd things. So very typical of Percival Everett from what I've read so far, of just taking this detached, ironic, absurd, funny point of view on issues. I think for me, the thing, you know, I enjoyed it. I don't think I loved it. I think Erasure and The Trees for me felt like there was a really important discussion at the heart of it, and the humor and the absurdism and the playfulness was sort of a way of delivering that in a velvet glove or delivering it in a fresh way. Whereas for Dr. No, I kind of felt that it was mostly just having fun, which is not, again, a bad thing with a book. It just felt a bit strange to me I kind of got to the end of the book. I'm like, well, that was fun, but kind of, I don't know. I kind of maybe expected it to go somewhere different. Still fun though. So yeah, do check it out if you're interested. And if you've read his other books, he's still well worth reading. He's ridiculous at what he does, yeah, it's a fun thing to check out. Next up, I read Munroe Bergdorf's book Transitional, and this is her memoir. In it, she talks a lot about growing up, particularly growing up as a young kid in an area where she was one of the very few people of color. She then talks a lot about her life as she sort of grows up, and particularly realizing that she's trans, realizing that you know, the kind of the ways that she is trying to fit in or adapt to a world that doesn't always treat her particularly well. And her kind of key idea, I guess, throughout the book is that all of us go through many transitional periods in our lives. So we often talk about transition mostly in the sense of, for example, trans people, but we don't necessarily always conceptualize it in quite the same way. Of actually, people's lives constantly involve updating and changing things, you know, whether that's them moving to a new place, whether that's going to a new job, whether it's sort of approaching a new relationship or thinking about, you know, their identity differently. All of those things come into kind of life and what it means to be alive and to be human. And so I think Munroe Bergdorf writes really powerfully about a lot of those things, about what it looks like to keep updating and changing yourself and your situation and your kind of circumstances as you go through life. She also touches on quite a few big things that have happened to her. So including, for example, a really abusive relationship she was in that involved some stalking. She talks a lot about a moment where she was fired publicly from a big media and sort of makeup brand deal, and the effect that that had on her, and, you know, people sending her death threats and all of these sorts of things. But now that she's back working with that company, so lots of really incredible and important and interesting things going on in this book. I think she writes really powerfully just about the sense of community and about finding herself. And it doesn't do a lot of the cliched things that sometimes we get with certain types of memoir. As in, you know, it doesn't always have to have a happy ending, but it does, in, you know, for her. But I think she explores these things really powerfully. She's not afraid to be quite critical of herself at times, or to kind of see that she maybe didn't know exactly what she was doing at certain points. But also there's a lot here that I did not know about her, you know, earlier life, that I think really adds a few more dimensions to someone who's often just on the news, having to sort of publicly defend her right to exist. So it's really nice to hear a little bit more from her when she's not having to argue with Piers Morgan, basically. But yeah, a really beautiful and important book. This sunlight is really, it's really happening today. What's going on? It is literally, for context, I'm filming this at about 2:30, and it has been grey all day. So anyway, this is quite nice. So the next book I read was David Copperfield by good old Charles Dickens. And I read this partly because I hadn't actually ever read it before, but also because I really wanted to read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And this, which, you know, is inspired by it. And so I kind of wanted to see what this was all about first, and really enjoyed it. I'd forgot, it's been so long since I last read a book by Dickens. And I think the last one was Nicholas Nickleby 10-15 years ago, which I loved. But I think the thing that was just so enjoyable about Dickens' writing in this book, and just in general, is he has a real ear for voice and for characters and for kind of creating these really believable setups. And David Copperfield itself has this sort of history of an underdog, this sort of story of an underdog who kind of makes his way in society in various ways and manages to carve out a place for himself in the world, despite having been dealt some difficult hands. And there's a kind of absurdity and fun to this book as well, which I really enjoyed. And now finally get a reference from Ben over at Doom Antidote about the donkey's Janet, which for ages I was like, what is this? Like, the donkey's Janet? What? And then at one point in the book it came up and I was like, oh, here we go, finally everything makes sense. And really enjoyable. And I'm now really keen to read Demon Copperhead and get a little bit more of a sense of that book too. And finally, I read two books by Alejandra Zambra, both translated by Megan McDowell, only one of which I actually have a physical copy of. So Bonsai is the story of a couple, well, yes, is it not? Who knows? Bonsai as a book intentionally tries to confuse and run circles around the reader in some way. So it sort of starts, it has a really fun narrative voice, I think, of sort of being like, well, this thing will happen and this story goes like this, but will it? Will it really? And then at the end of the book, it's sort of like, well, Julio's story ends here. So there's a lot of this kind of playfulness of kind of a meta kind of novel. It's kind of, it almost feels like it's going for like an anti-novel status, I guess, throughout the book. And a lot of that is, you know, talking about this couple and the ways they move through the world, and intentionally not being particularly focused on it. We'll throw in some literary references and then we'll go off over this other tangent and we'll eventually come back to the couple. That is then followed by The Private Lives of Trees, by the same author and the same translator. And in that, he refers to something from Bonsai. So in Bonsai, we have a reference of a story where a couple spends all their time together, and then at one point realize that, you know, they grow this bonsai together, and that bonsai is meant to be their love. And at one point they give away this bonsai to stop it kind of holding them back, and they lose it in this sort of market of millions of other bonsai trees, and they never get it back. And then in the private lives of trees, we have somebody retelling and looking at that story and being involved in it in their own way and kind of growing this tree. And so we kind of get this reference where these two books basically are almost one book combined, of a kind of a book about a story and then a commentary or book about this other story, which, you know, for some people isn't necessarily their favorite thing. I actually quite enjoyed how it did it. I think Bonsai personally is more effective. I really enjoyed Bonsai. I struggled a little bit more with the Private Lives of Trees, but I still think it's doing some quite interesting and fun things. It's just a very different universe, but I can see why he's sort of seen as this sort of wunderkind in Chile, as this kind of very experimental, new, young writer kind of thing. Anyway, I've been Bob the Bookerer. Those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a great reading week, and take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.